Buongiorno a tutti. Good morning, everyone. Quanti di voi non parlano italiano? You don't speak Italian. That's good. At least I have a purpose here. All right, then. Good morning, everyone, and thank you for being here. I appreciate you giving up some of your time to listening to me today. I also want to take the opportunity to thank the organizers for allowing for an English track, because that's basically the only language I'm comfortable with when it comes to public speaking. My name is on the screen. It's Vincenzo Russo, so I am Italian after all, but I have spent a lot of time abroad. That's why I'm saying that. You can call me that as well if you speak English only. I'm currently employed by Upsun, which is a French scale-up. We are a tech company, a product company. We develop a cloud application platform. Right? And so that's part of the talk today as well. I recently moved in this new role, which is a specialist solution engineer for channels and partners. That's why probably it doesn't match the agenda. The talk today is entitled Freedom to Code, Reclaiming Time and Mental Health by Automating 7 Biggest Burdens of Drupal DevOps. That's a bit of a mouthful as a title. Someone told me that it wasn't very clear what he actually was talking about today. Hopefully it will become clear as we go ahead with this. Little bit of background about me that probably explains also why I chose to talk about this topic today. My life is a bit of a story of two worlds, really. Spent my life 50-50 between Italy and the UK. My education is also 50-50 between science and something completely different, theology. I've been in tech for more than 25 years, but I became bivocational in 2012 with a second job that's got more to do with my second degree than with the first one. Hands-on engineer and people manager at the same time, and probably the most controversial point on the slide there is that I work with both Drupal and WordPress at the same time, but I spend more time with Drupal, starting, if I remember correctly, with 5.4, all the way to 8 when I was still hands-on, and then I moved into different things, but I continue to follow the community, and I'll take this chance actually to say that the community is doing an extremely good job recently in the past 18 months with the AI initiative and everything else. It's been amazing. So that's me in a nutshell, and essentially it's my dual vocation that brings me to blend these two topics today together. So the table of contents for today is on the screen. So the first 2 points are going to set the scene a little bit, just to give a bit of background of where I'm drawing these facts from. They're coming from real life, from my career, from my experience. So we're going to have a quick question, efficiency or capacity. Then we're going to have just some assumptions and background, and then we're going to get into the gist of it. So we're going to see the problem that we want to highlight and trying to avoid at the same time. We're going to look at these 7 burdens, and obviously 7 is a number I picked because it's a nice number. Your experience may differ a little bit, but that's essentially 7 real difficulties that I encountered with my teams over the years. Then we are going to look at the transformation process that managed to heal, to remove these 7 burdens, and brought my team, this particular team I'm talking about today, into a state which I call freedom to code. So a state where the developers that I had in my team were free to focus on their job without being distracted by everything else that was going on around them. And if I'm good enough with time, we're probably going to have some time for Q&A as well. So the first question I was mentioning is efficiency or capacity. So the story I'm drawing this from is back when I was mainly an independent Drupal consultant in London, and my specialty was about optimizing processes, development processes, deployment processes, team dynamics as well. And so oftentimes, the traditional conventional way of doing this optimization was by looking at efficiency. But when you look at efficiency, you're looking at time, trying to increase productivity and velocity. And then at some point it becomes obvious that if you only focus on that, you don't necessarily achieve the goals that you want to achieve. It's very important to focus on capacity, particularly mental capacity. So what's on the screen there that looks like a quote, it's not actually a quote, it's a summary of the book that you see the cover of on the screen. It's a book from Cal Newport, which is a professor of computer science in the United States, obviously author of many books. And there's a core lesson here. It says that the core resource in any kind of knowledge work is focused attention. right? If we cannot attain and maintain focus, we cannot produce valuable work. So this is essentially why we're talking about what we're talking about today. We need some way of optimizing processes. We keeping an eye on the human resources as well, because we want to make sure that people can be in a state of deep work, or it's also called the flow state. Very quick assumptions. I'm making this assumption more for the sake of time, and not because I expect all of you to be familiar with that, although you probably are anyway. So I'm going to take for granted concepts like, Drupal enterprise best practices, in-code configuration management, continuous integration, continuous delivery, composer dependency management, database migrations by update hooks, and automated testing. And these are the very things that sometimes when they're done in a DIY fashion can actually produce the burdens that we actually want to solve. In terms of background and where I'm drawing these facts from, it comes from a big project I led a few years ago. It was a digital transformation initiative that lasted 7 years. It was in the public sector, one of the departments of the government in England. And we ended up with over 250 websites and applications based on Drupal. And all of this was done with a cross-functional Scrum team. Now, without this, without further ado, we can actually get to the core of the talk. So the problem that we want to talk about is burnout, right? So why is this important? Because people are machines, okay? A machine, if we are diligent enough, is something that we can replace at some point, right? Because we can restore it from a backup. And the worst that can happen is that you actually have to incur some financial costs, and that's fair enough, but you can replace a machine with another machine, it's just going to work just the same. However, when a human burns out, that's a completely different story, because the recovery process from burnout is actually sometimes very long and it's tedious. Not only that, but the path that leads to burnout is usually characterized by performance degradation. And if you don't have a keen eye for these things, what happens is that you see performance degradation in people and you're going to assume the wrong things, and you don't necessarily see that as something that leads to burnout. And so maybe as a manager, you can take the wrong choices in that case. But what's most important for me is, it became really important to realize that unlike machines, there are resources that work for your organization and for your team. The human resources in your organizations are not just working for you. These people have got life outside of work, and when they reach burnout, that's gonna have a ripple effect in their lives as well. So we must be very careful with people. So in order to put these in a more scientific framework, very simple, I'm using this model from occupational psychology. It's called the JDR model. It's the job demands and resources model. It's a very simple model. It talks about job demands and job resources and how these two things are supposed to be balanced in order for you to have a healthy situation. Job demands is anything that has got to do with your job, really. It could be physical, social, or organizational aspects of your job that involve both physical and psychological effort and costs from your side. And so these essentially are the demands put upon you. The resources, the job resources, are essentially what you have within your job in terms of resources, tools, means, and support in order to achieve and to fulfill those demands. And these are usually, achieving your goals at the corporate level, at the organizational level, but also from a personal growth point of view. And it could be the lack of resources or the presence of resources that cannot be easily utilized that can bring to problems. Now, this is a very simple model where you can put your job demands on the y-axis and the job resources on the x-axis, and you're going to end up essentially with four major situations. We are not going to look at the bottom ones because we are not interested in those today. What we're interested in is the top two quadrants. The top left quadrant, which is red, is exactly the quadrant that we want to avoid, and that's the quadrant called burnout and strain. And usually our focus here is on the health impairment pathway. That is that process, that path that actually leads people to exhaustion. When does this happen? It happens when you have a high effort and no support. You have high demands and no resources, or you have a set of resources that is very difficult and complex for you to utilize, and so you cannot actually utilize them well, and you cannot fulfill your demands. These will bring you to exhaustion. Instead, what you really want is a nice balance between demands and resources. So you have high challenge, high efforts, high resources, and that puts you in a state of learning, and a state that's also called flow and growth. It's a healthy state where you, instead of having an impairment pathway, you have a motivational pathway. And so your mental health is actually in a good state. What's important to highlight, it's not part of the topic today, but it's important to highlight, is that the GDR model gives you a way to assess the balance between demands and resources, but it doesn't actually tell you how to size your demands, which means you can still have a very high level of demands and all the resources to meet those demands, but in that case, you're moving into a space, it's called over-engagement. And that also causes a different kind of problems that we're not going to talk about today. Now, a couple of more definitions. In this framework, you have something called techno-stress creators. And there are many, but these are the two fundamental ones. And this is the point where I start mentioning names as well. Now, obviously, the names that you see on the screens are made up for privacy reasons, but they are actual people that I work with. So you have technical complexity. So that's the feeling that your resources essentially are either fragmented or difficult to utilize. So in a technical project, in a software engineering project, like with a Drupal project, you have a situation where maybe technology around your development work feels too difficult or counterintuitive or fragmented, and that actually is exactly the same as having no resources to support you in fulfilling your demands. And this is what affected, for example, Michael. Michael was actually good at his job, but he was a person that, by character, by personality, would thrive in an environment that is orderly. Instead, the environment he was working in felt to him chaotic, and he couldn't actually perform well in that context. The other techno-stress creator is very common, is techno-overload. That's the pressure to constantly keep up with something that is surrounding the actual job. So in a software engineering project, this could be troubleshooting the technology, managing the technology, firefighting the infrastructure, making sure that everything else like scripts and deployments and pipelines are in a good state and you're using them in the right order, all these kind of things. So this is techno-overload, meaning that this is beyond what you originally signed up for. It's distracting you in a sense. So this could have different impacts on different people. For example, on Dave, this created a low-grade sense of anxiety where Dave eventually felt like his work was a bit of a gamble because not always, he had to deal with those overload and the results were not always systematically reproducible. Whereas for Sarah was very simple. She was good at her job, but she didn't want to be distracted with all of that. She felt frustrated, eventually ended up in disengagement. Now, the pushbacks that sometimes I get on these stories is that, you just have to suck it up and learn the additional technology. But the reality is, if there is a way to provide a better environment for these people so that they can really focus on what they are good at, then we should find that way. You get a sip of water, please. So, the 7 burdens are actually our job demands, and they become burdens because, again, we don't have the right resources to deal with them. Now, for a bit of context, these burdens come from the second stage of the project I was mentioning earlier. I won't mention the first phase, which was an utter mess, and we had to do a lot of work there to get to this second stage. In this second stage, we have a situation where I sit down and I started to design a number of tools and processes and documentation in order to allow my team to actually handle what was all this enterprise flow that we had to deal with, because we had a situation where everybody had to have their local development environment, but then we had to go through a strict process of deploying in different environments from that, going at least to stage and then to production. And also we had to have the ability to move configurations and other things that normally live in a database through code in a systematic way. This is one of the problems that you have with software like Drupal and other CMSs, where there is a reason why the configuration actually lives in the database. So eventually we ended up with a bunch of things. We had Jenkins, we had Vagrant, We had a contractor, a external contractor for us to manage bare metal clusters with production and staging environment. They were supposed to be on parity, but it didn't always work. In a nutshell, the situation was a bit fragmented and brittle. I could deal with it because I was the one that designed it. I could deal with the problems, but not everybody could do that. Eventually, it created a number of issues. We're going to see those. So burden number one is inconsistent environments. So raise your hand if you never had this problem. Yeah, thought so. So the situation is this, even though I tried very hard to make sure that at least amongst the team, they always had a consistent local environment, there were always situations where this didn't happen, right? So because, there was Vagrant first, then Docker later, because that came later, and I made documentation, I made everything possible for, to make it easy for them to have these things, but it will always be the case they will run into issues, and I wasn't always around to fix those issues for them, and they will fall back on other things, and they will end up with different environments, different configurations of PHP, database, Redis, and of course that creates issues because the work wouldn't always, function the same on other environments when you move down the pipeline of the deployments. But the psychological cost of this was what we call technical uncertainty. It's nothing fancy. It's just words from a paper. But essentially, you can't trust your work. And these affected Dave particularly because he felt like his work was becoming like a gamble, right? So he became sort of fearful, that things would actually go wrong without him having any control on how to avoid that. So that's one issue. Then we have burden number two, configuration management. Now, again, I was just mentioning this. With software like Drupal, there is a good reason why the configuration originally sits in the database, and that's fine. But when you have a situation where you have to move this configuration from one place to another, and then to another, and then to another, and it always has to deploy in the same consistent way, then it starts to create issues, right? So the psychological cost here is that it's a big flow breaker, right? So that goes back to the bit. Sorry, it's gone off. I would say it's a flow breaker because it goes back to the beginning of the slides because it takes you away from that state of deep work. And so it's also a source of technical complexity because there is a lot that you need to make sure to do and to do in the right order. And this is also tied to the next burden, which is data drift and database synchronization. Now here also, we have a situation, it's been very common in all my Drupal projects, in other projects, they are very similar in setup like Drupal, where it's very important for your work to be tested against a fresh copy of the production database. It must be so because if you're running updates against the database, you're importing configuration, you need to make sure that those are working with the state that you have in production and not whatever state that you have locally or any other environment. So database sync can create a lot of issues, practical issues, like, okay, how do I do this? I need a process to do this. Okay, what if I have huge databases? How do I synchronize these very quickly to any of the environment I have to test with? If you have a multi-environment stage pipeline, then you have to do this over and over again. If the database is large, then it becomes a time issue. But also, you have privacy and security concerns because you don't necessarily have the permission to synchronize the database with the live data. You need to sanitize them before it gets to any other place. So there is a lot of stuff going on, and you have what's called the techno overload, and you end up in techno insecurity as well because you are fearful that you're trying to do your job, but you do something wrong, especially in terms of security and compliance with privacy. So the burdens get bigger and bigger as we go ahead. Sort of tied to all of this is also dependency management, right? So with a composer-based workflow, you have dependencies that you have to manage. It was the same in the old days when you had Drushmake, if you use that. Essentially, you have these chores that get bigger. The list of chores in managing your dependencies gets bigger and bigger if you don't manage it. It's a distraction from your work, but it's also chaotic in a sense. And that's, like I already mentioned, Michael wouldn't function well in a chaotic environment. It was always trying to bring order out of chaos because it's order that he functioned in. So it was a prerequisite for him, and so also a constant distraction for him, and so he wouldn't perform very well. Now we get to the final three, which get really big, right? So infrastructure firefighting, that this all depends on the size of the project that you're working with, the scale of the number of web projects that you're deploying to this infrastructure. But overall these days, my average experience with projects like this is that they're always cloud first. There is always more than it used to be involved. You can also have Kubernetes clusters involved in all of this. So the infrastructure gets more and more complex as we go ahead through the years. What's really important about this is that when there is an issue that gets alerted at the infrastructure level, it's my experience that there is not just the people that deal with the infrastructure that get alerted. Yes, they are the first line, but then the rest of the team gets alerted as well. Because it could be anything that you have done at the application level that is actually causing the infrastructure to stress underneath. And so the infrastructure engineers will come to you and say, look, we have seen this. Maybe it's caused by this deployment. Can you have a look? Because I've seen these certain issues with the memory or with the high load on the CPUs, and the infrastructure is scaling out of control. We need to fix this because otherwise the costs are going to be too high. And so what really is here the problem from a psychological point of view is that we have a direct path to burnout, because this situation introduces what's called techno invasion. Essentially, you are not free to clock out of your job, because there's always something at the back of your mind where you see, I might be called up anytime, So I worked several times in situations where people were on call all the time because this could happen, and you don't want this to happen. All right, it's very stressful. But the number 6, deployment pipeline. Well, here I'm overstating the point a little bit, because this was the early version of the burden. Over time, I tried to make this much better, trying to implement automated pipelines that would work just the same on local environment as they would work on the other environments, staging, production, and everything else. However, when the scale of your project is quite big, the complexity is still there. So of the 250 applications that I mentioned earlier, we ended up with 150 being essentially based on the same Drupal distribution that we developed ourselves. So that means that every time we had a new version of this distribution, that needed to go out to 150 websites at once, all at once. And so we had to repeat that process on staging and then on production, with all the testing team involved and everybody else involved to make sure that everything was going right. What's worse is that when it didn't go right, then you have to roll back, and that's even more of a nightmare. So this is a big thing. So the psychological cost here, there is a lot of frustration, essentially. People that suffer, particularly from that kind of pressure, they become disengaged, right? So if you see people disengaged, it's natural for you to say, oh, these people, they are no longer motivated. There might be more to it than just that. But the number 7, this is my favorite, in a sense that is the most common one now. Nowadays, more than it used to be, because security and privacy has become really prominent and important in all the projects. It's really, really hard to keep up with everything that's got to do with security compliance, especially when you have a complex infrastructure. This goes all the way from the application level, all the way down to your containers, to your servers, to your operating system. And when you have when you have SLAs of 2 hours to deploy all the security patches in your production system, it gets really, really stressful. It's a huge mental load. So we come to an end of the 7 burdens. How do we solve this? Well, there is
A new burden.
There you go, new burden. These are the basics. So, okay, it's back to normal. I'll try to be as gentle as possible this time. There you go. So how do we solve this? We can solve this in many different ways, but the reality is you want to solve this in a way that you don't have to spend time on it. You're going to spend money either way, because you have to spend money if you want to solve these problems. But do you want to take care of these in an ongoing fashion, or you want to completely forget about all these problems, right? So in the top bottom box over here, there is a selection of tools that you could use to try and make life easier for this team that I was talking about. And I did try to make it as much as possible. The reality is that to get from this white box to what we eventually got from this yellow box over here is, oh, the title is messed up, anyway. It's a lot of work, right? So if I, obviously, this is obvious, I don't have to hide it. Obviously, I work for one of the companies that produces something like that, right? Back in those days, I wasn't, but it was something like that that saved my team. If you want to get there very efficiently, it's very hard. I'm not going to make names, but there is a very big name in the software industries right now that is partnered with us that tried to make something like that over the space of 3 years, investing $5 million, and they failed miserably because it's a lot of work. But what's important is that you want to be in this situation over here, right? So you want to be in a nice, modern development workflow where you only care as a developer about the purple bit and you forget about all the yellow bits. You want to be in a situation where you can focus, and your focus as a developer, and I've been a developer myself, what I like to do is, okay, I want to write my code, I want to push my code, I want to see it working. Everything else, I don't care about. That's where I want to be, essentially, right? Unless you really like all the other bits, but then you'll be working on the other side, right? So that's fine. But if I'm working on this side, the purple bit is what I really like, where I really like to be. So, what do we get from the yellow box? How does it work? Why is it so good? What psychological benefits we can get from it? So we get, first and foremost, Git-driven ephemeral environments. And we gain autonomy, consistency, and predictability. Now, this solves burden number 1 and burden number 3, data drift, and so data sync as well. So imagine a situation where you have your production environment, and you have, let's talk about one project. Your project is made up, of course, of your Drupal web application that is running in one container, then you have a database is running in a different container, then you have Redis is running in a different container, you have Varnish maybe, you're running again in a different container. You may have even more services in this. The collection of these containers is your production environment. Now you have to work on a new feature. Imagine the situation where you branch out, and within 2 minutes you get a full stack copy of everything, no matter the size of everything. You don't have to do anything, you just branch out on a Git branch, that's it. That's your focus, you have a Git repo, you branch, and everything comes directly to you in a new environment, full stack preview of that. And now, what you have is your code in your repo, and additionally, only a single file in addition, which is a very simple YAML file that defines your infrastructure. Now, your infrastructure is coming with you. You don't have to touch that if your infrastructure is working for you. But what if you have to develop a feature where you need something new? For example, there wasn't a queue, now you need a queue system. Okay, you had a couple of lines of configuration, you set up the queue service, and that's there for you, deployed automatically, just the configuration. It will be there for you. Plus, the system will create all the relationships between these containers and will serve you the access details on a server plate, basically on an environment variable, where you just grab it and you use it. And this is done over and over again every time you branch out. And everything always works with the same copy of the data. And if you need sanitization of data, of course, you can write your logic for the sanitization, and you plug it in, and so you get sanitized data on non-production environments. And when you're done, and you have tested everything, and your infrastructure is changed as well, you don't have to care about any of that. You don't have to involve any platform engineers. You just have to merge, and the infrastructure will be updated automatically. Now, you can see how this process completely changes the situation. People don't have to think about anything anymore. They just need to think about their code and a couple of lines of configuration that if they're not familiar with too much, they can always ask for someone else help, but it's going to be a very simple situation, especially if you have good documentation. So essentially, you're provided with a way of provisioning instant environments, a resource allocation, you have automated setup, you're now starting to focus on code, you have a bit-by-bit cloning and backups, and you also have APIs if you really need them. Most of the time you don't. Obviously, this implies that you have an integrated CI/CD and atomic deployment that solves burden 2, burden 4, and burden 6, configuration management, dependency and patching management, and the deployment pipeline. And you get a situation where you have a very simple 3-stage pipeline: commit, build, and deploy. Of course, commit includes the push into the repo, into the remote, if you have to deploy somewhere else other than your local environment. And the simplest form of build for your Drupal project these days is just composer, right? So of course you can add other things there, but you do it once and you forget about it if it doesn't have to change. And then the same is for the deployment stage. After the build, you have to deploy the artifact on the container and then run some updates, maybe. So if your database is empty, you can even decide to auto-install your Drupal installation. And so this was very good for us because we had to do this over and over and over again. So what we did was like, okay, clone the repo, push it up, I got a new website, and they start working on it. And then when it's already installed, you can have additional steps like cache rebuild, update DB, and config import. And those are there, written once, and forgot about it. And nobody has to care about remembering when to run them, how to run them, because they always run every time you essentially do a Git push. And if you don't have code to push, but you still have to retest your deployment, there's a very simple command. You just refresh the database, and the deployment runs again. And you do this over and over again, systematically, over all the environments, because it's done in a way that the artifacts are always the same everywhere. A corollary of this is in the next slide. So essentially, if you have the ability to actually integrate with GitHub or GitLab or whatever you're using, you can also put your dependency in autopilot, right? This is really something that, in addition to that, really changes, because all those chores I was talking about, you don't have to do them anymore. If you do this setup very well, you're going to forget about it completely. So this is a project where I have almost 600 pull requests closed. The majority of these are dependency updates, and I'm not doing anything. Dependent bot sees the change in the dependency, issues a pull request. The pull request creates an environment. Once the environment is created, it triggers the tests. The tests are my security checks on my pull request. They all check. When they all check, auto merge goes to production. I completely forgot about them. It just does. So you don't want to have this stuff in the way of your developers, because your developers care about producing value, not updating dependencies. Finally, is, if we zoom out, we have essentially an abstraction. This cloud application platform is providing you with a unified deployment and development workflow that puts you in a condition where really you don't have to care about almost anything else other than your own code if you're a Drupal developer. Infrastructure firefighting is covered for, and security compliance is covered for. So you have essentially almost zero ops, managed infrastructure, auto scaling, backups and healing, monitoring, observability, and everything else that comes with it. And the result is essentially that you finally, at last, are free to code. That's where you focus, and everything else you can forget about. Obviously, at the beginning I said, the conventional way of optimizing looks at time, efficiency, sometimes costs as well. And it's not that we have done away with that. Obviously, when you optimize processes, if you do it well, you are still going to end up in increased efficiency. So before I talk about the conclusions from a psychological point of view, I still want to give you some numbers of what changed for us over the space of 3 years. Year one, we gained back 50% of our time, then 25%, and then 35%, going all the way from almost 2,000 hours regained to more than 4,000 hours regained. And we made an estimate that at least 50% of those hours that were regained from the time wasted before went back into development. And the remaining 50% was spent still on useful things like the Scrum, rituals, and everything else that you had to do as part of the team. So there was an increase in efficiency. But that was also possible because we had a psychological payoff. The team, mental health, was essentially healed very, very quickly because people were put back in their seats. They had, again, the ability to do their jobs without being distracted, and the environment that was fruitful for them. So we have Dave that was fearful regaining his confidence, Michael that was feeling defeated because although he was good at his job, everything else was making him feel like he wasn't, And then we have Sarah that was frustrated. Actually, she went back into flow state. Now I could see this then very young girl just sitting there and doing her job without complaining about anything and producing a lot because she was in flow state. So you have this flow state happens when skill meets challenge, right? So by abstracting all this noise away, everyone was able to go in a deep state of concentration, and so maximizing creativity and job satisfaction. But there is also something else that happened that I wasn't necessarily aiming for at the time. There was another member of the team that we're going to call the lone wolf here, with a fake name, Chris. And so we also gained psychological safety. What does that mean? So this person that was hired at some point, wasn't there from the beginning, essentially was relying on the situation that we had, right? He was thriving off the fact that he could actually work out everything, all the difficulties. He would help. He became a silo of knowledge, okay, while I was doing other things, to actually keep the team running at the best that he could. But the problem is, the moment we solved the 7 burdens, he sort of became redundant, right? So we didn't fire Chris, right? So he decided to leave because he didn't see a place for himself anymore. He wasn't a team player. The only reason he was there is because he made himself indispensable. The moment he was no longer indispensable, he just decided to move on. And this was good for the team because Chris wasn't a team player, and this would have infringed on psychological safety. By with Chris moving away from the team, we actually made sure that the team had a very healthy state of mind. So that was also good for everybody because Chris moved on, he was happy like that, it was fine. And just as a side note, it's not on the slide, I moved on from this project now for 4 years. The team is almost unchanged, they are still there, they're still going strong, so I'm very happy about that. Conclusions. So we're at the end of this. I'm doing very well with time, actually. Spoke too fast, perhaps? I don't know. Maybe I did. Conclusions. So by the way, before I say the conclusions, I'm curious, you can let me know later if you recognize that logo over there. Because if you do, you're cool. You're cool anyway. So we have the resource flip. We turned job demands in job resources. So we went from chaos to predictability. We have a psychological win. Psychological win, yes. We replaced techno stress with flow state. So we went from overload and complexity to deep concentration and creativity. And the ultimate goal is that people were now free to be themselves and to care about their job and their work. They were doing what they signed up for, and they were happy for that. And the whole organization was happy for that because they increased in velocity, in productivity, and it was a good team at the end of the day. So, yeah, it turned out good. So this is it, and thank you for listening. Now there's plenty of time, apparently 7 minutes for questions and answers. Don't feel pressured. If you don't have questions, I won't take it personally, but if you do, please ask away.
I do have one. I'm curious about one of the slides where you were showing all the automatic updates with the Vendables. How do you cope with the risk that some country module can introduce breaking change in a patch revision?
Yeah, no, that's a good question. Obviously, it can happen. I didn't go into the details of this, but of course you can configure all of this, right? You can say, okay, I only want minor updates to be automatic. And if people are good, you're not going to introduce breaking changes in a minor update.
It happens.
It happens. If you do, I'm going to be very angry with you. And then after that, I'm going to exclude your modules from automatic updates. I'm going to deal with that separately. But overall, 99% of the time it goes well because if you have a policy and you respect that policy, it goes just fine. It also depends on how critical your project is, right? So I can afford this on this project because this is one of my personal projects. I don't really care if it breaks. So here I have a very loose policy where I just update everything. But with serious projects, you just define your policies, and everything else that doesn't fit in that policy, you handle it separately.
Can you handle also possible hook updates that creates or updates some config. So, for example, let's say you move from paragraph from 112 to 113, they introduce a new hook update that changes the configuration of something. I don't know. How do you deal with this update?
Deal with what exactly? Whether I can run?
Because the update will produce a different configuration. So
right,
it has to be exported to have it in code to move it back in production.
Oh, right, I see what I mean. You produce new configuration. Yeah, exactly. You will notice that later. You can always, we had a process where we would be notified, whether there was a mismatch between the code and the configuration database. If you get that, then of course you get an issue in your backlog and you work on that issue, you fix it, you export the configuration back to code and then back through.
Okay, so you have a warning for...
Yeah, exactly, yeah. So there was an additional step. I didn't show all the steps, but there was an additional step that would run a command to check whether there was a mismatch between configuration in code and configuration in the database. And that step was always running because you never know. Sometimes new configuration may get in for whatever reason, so you don't know that. Yeah.
Okay, thank you.
What? Go ahead.
Sorry, I joined late, so maybe you have already covered this. How do you, as I understand it, the developer just clones the repository, has all the containers rather than before his or her development, and goes from there.
Yeah.
How do you manage secrets like passwords, any other kind of connections to external systems that might be integrated? Because this normally happens in the deployment pipeline, where you put it in the variables and so on.
Sure, yeah. That's a very good question. So the product that we were using has an ability to manage secrets, obviously. Obviously, you can't do that through code because you don't want to have secrets in code.
Yes.
You could, but you'd be, yeah. But yeah, no, we had a different pipeline to manage those essentially, right? So that would talk to the APIs directly. That was done on site.
Okay, so when the developer pulls the code down, they have to run some additional configuration so that they have local environment set up.
That's done automatically for them. So new secrets are made up on the way. So, yeah. The configuration knows that you need secrets, and it will create secrets. So they are just for your local environment. So,
one on the management level, I think it was Chris who was indispensable because of his knowledge and then left the company. How did you, if you were to introduce such a change where the infrastructure people or the people with the knowledge of the system, how it works, the nuts and bolts, they are part of the system kind of. How do you convince these people? Because in my organization, they would probably never leave. But cause the enormous amount of resistance in order to come up with something that helps the development and the creative flow, because it hinders or threatens their...
Yeah, okay, that's a big...
How did you, if there is any...
Yeah, I mean, I'll try to answer that. I don't have a direct experience with that because where I'm drawing this story from, we didn't really have dedicated platform engineers because they were outsourced, right? So it was an external company that were doing that. The moment we changed completely, then we just ceased the contract with the company, and that was it. Chris was essentially a Drupal developer, but he was thriving on the fact that he could understand all these fragmented situation, and he could help everybody else, right? So it sort of became a single point of failure for everybody else. So it's a different situation. He wasn't a dedicated resource as a platform engineer, and he just decided to move on because of that. But in your case, there are different ways to tackle that, right? So there would be, I'm not sure it's the case for you, but there could be ways to repurpose those engineers in doing other things. It depends on the complexity of the projects that you have as well. So when you have a platform like this, obviously a lot of problems are already solved for you. That doesn't mean you don't have anything else to solve, because you can still build on top of the platform, right? So this is a platform that you adopt, obviously, if you have a high complexity to manage, right? So if you're a big agency that is managing hundreds of thousands of projects, or big organizations that is doing pretty much the same thing, then it could be the case and that is why APIs are provided where you have to build on top of it. And you can repurpose, you can move those people. Okay, you were doing like low-level infrastructure management, now I need you to build a better platform on top of this, right? So you're just working at a higher level than you were doing before. Now, they might not be happy about that, I don't know. It could be the case, but essentially, if you are in charge of managing the organization, it's up to you to decide, the vision of the company. If they don't fit in their vision anymore and they don't like the new job that's been assigned to them, well, they're free to move on, right? It's just part of life.
Thank you.
Yeah, you're welcome. We are at time, 45 minutes. So unless you have any more questions, we're done? Well, thank you very much. I appreciate your time today.
Thank you.